my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you my wrap-up and discussion of the books that are nominated for Best Novel in the Hugo Awards this year. As I am filming this, Worldcon is ongoing in DC. I'm not there, but I've been attending virtually. I've watched a few panels, but I've not been as involved as I might have been if I had not been as busy with stuff. That said, I am taking my last opportunity to film this video before the Hugo Award ceremony happens. However, I don't expect that I'll have this video edited and uploaded by the time the awards are announced. So by the time you're seeing this, you will already know the winners, but I do not know that yet at the time of filming, so these are my thoughts and opinions, unbiased by the results. Now, I have been constantly disappointed with myself for how little I've managed to read this year, and that extends, of course, to the works on the Hugo Award ballot. I didn't read in nearly as many of the categories as I wanted to. I didn't read nearly as many of the books as I wanted to. The only category in which I actually read everything nominated was short story, so I'm going to touch on that before I get into the novels. My top two in the short story category were Open House on Haunted Hill by Wiswell and The Mermaid, Astronaut by Yoon Lee. I'm not really going to talk about them here, but I'm just going to link those two stories in the description as recommendations from me to you. Now, in the novel category, I read 5 out of the 6 nominees. The one that I didn't read was The Relentless Moon by Mary Robinette Kowal. I didn't read this because I'm not caught up on the series. I had expected that I might be able to read book 2 as part of my Hugo reading this year. The series is nominated as well as the 3rd volume. Book 2 is The Fated Sky. I didn't even get around to reading The Fated Sky because I have come to the realization that I'm very hesitant to continue on with this series, even though I really did like book 1, The Calculating Stars, when I read it, because of the aspects of the premise of this series, the alternate history doomsday scenario that feels so bleak to me and has such strong parallels with our current climate change doomsday scenario that we seem to be doing nothing to avert in our timeline. It just, the idea of diving back into this world right now makes me anxious, and so I'm not doing it. I do fully expect that when and if I continue with this series, I will continue to like them, but I keep being antsy about picking up book 2, and I am just gonna let that be for now. I'm not gonna push myself. That said, all the other books that I read from the best novel list, I was really pleased with. I'm really pleased with the depth and breadth of this shortlist this year. I don't feel like there's anything on this list that doesn't belong there, that isn't in some way worthy of consideration for an award. And so my personal ranking of these books for voting purposes ended up being purely based on personal preference. So it is completely unsurprising to me that the books that I ranked 1 and 2 are the 2 books on this list that I was super excited about before their release enough to pre-order them. Both of these books I read as soon as I got my hands on them, as soon as those pre-orders arrived. Both of them I read in like a day. These were some of my best, most positive reading experiences of 2020. And I read these both in months that I didn't do monthly wrap-ups for, so I haven't actually wrapped up either of these books, although I have talked about them and recommended them in other videos. So this is going to serve as my wrap-up for these books. The first that I rated 5 stars was Network Effect by Martha Wells, the 5th book and first full-length novel in the Murderbot Diaries series, and the second that I actually rated 4 stars, even though I had a very positive experience with it. It was a high 4 stars. That is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. So starting with my 5-star read of the batch, Network Effect. The one downside of this as a Hugo nominee is that it is the 5th book in a series, and you do have to read the previous 4 novellas to get the full story out of this, I think. But the basic premise of this book is that our point of view protagonist, Murderbot, who is a biological / AI hybrid character created to be a security unit, is now working for the people on Preservation Station, who it met and befriended in the previous books. At the beginning of this book, Murderbot is working with a team from Preservation that includes some recurring characters and some new characters on another survey-type mission, when in a mysterious turn of events, they are all sort of attacked and abducted, and Murderbot has to protect its humans and figure out what's going on. The plot of this book goes way beyond that initial premise and setup in ways that I actually don't remember in clear enough detail to talk about in any great depth. I did read this in May of 2020. The big selling point of this book, though, for fans of the series is that we get the return of Art, the asshole research transport from Artificial Condition, and this is very much a Murderbot Art book. This does dive deeper into some of the thematic questions raised about the corporation Rim in this series and like the ethics of corporate space colonization. It introduces to the series some ideas about resistance against the Corporation Rim, but it is still very character-driven. Throughout the books, you do get some flashbacks that take you out of the main narrative and show you more about Murderbot's life on Preservation since it came there after the events of Book 4. These flashbacks are all labeled in the text as excerpts from something called helpme.file, and you figure out what that is and why that's there fairly late on in the story. There's a reason for it, but functionally as like a narrative device, it does serve to take you back out of the main action that's happening, which is very fast-paced and high stakes, and give you some more of this character development content. This is excellent. I love it. I need to reread it. I am very excited that we are going to continue to get more books in this series. I will definitely reread this one before Book 7 comes out. Book 6 is Fugitive Telemetry, and it takes place between books 4 and 5, so that's out of chronological order. So when eventually we get another book, I personally plan on rereading this one, but probably not Fugitive Telemetry. And then Piranesi is another one that I have very little to say about because it is the type of book, as I think just about everyone else who has tried to review this has said, it is one of those books that you probably have the purest, most close to intended experience with if you go in as blind as possible. This is almost nothing like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but I think there are some specific themes of interest that you can tell are a through line between these two novels in Susanna Clarke's writing. I think they both share a fascination with the sort of contrasting ideas of academia as like the need to know and understand the world, and magic on the other hand as that which is potentially not understandable, the world of magic being broader and more beautiful than we can conceive of it as being, but also potentially more dangerous. This takes place in a house in which the main character, who we know as Piranesi, lives, and that he perceives to be the world. It seems potentially infinite. It spreads in all directions. There are waters and tides, clouds and birds, lots of statues. He has no understanding of the world outside of this house, and his understanding of the house as the world is reverent, bordering on religious, possibly more than just bordering on religious. The only other living human he knows of is someone referred to as the Other, whose attitude toward the house is very, very different. They are both gathering knowledge about the house that is this world, but to very different ends, and that's just about all I want to say. One of the most noticeable things in the very beginning portions of this book is that the narration, Piranesi's narration of this story, uses capital letters to make everything that exists within the house a proper noun, and like that's a freaking lot of capitalization, especially very early on in the book where it starts out as basically like a description of the house. If you've picked up this book and just like looked at the opening pages and thought, no, I can't do this, this is too much, this will get very annoying, I do want to reassure you that the capitalization gets significantly less annoying as the book progresses. There is significantly less of it, and the extent to which it is pervasive feels, to me at least, like it becomes far less in your face. This is another book that I think I would love to reread at some point, having read it once, very quickly, sort of inhaled it in one go and taken the reveals as they came. I would like to go back and be able to sort of more slowly digest it now that I know what is going on in it. These two books could not be more different as contenders for a Hugo Award. This is fairly straightforward space sci-fi adventure that happens to have extremely good character work and some well-developed ideas. This is very unusual fantasy. That said, they are both books that felt like they were very much my cup of tea. In fact, I think the only reason I gave Piranesi 4 stars out of 5 is because that this is so much my cup of tea that I had read other books that were similar enough to this very strange book that I liked more and could compare it to, which is saying something, given how strange and unusual this book is. Is this the type of book that Worldcon fandom more broadly would award a Hugo Award to? I really don't know. I'm very curious to see how this is going to rank when the final ballot counts are released. And then, because I know myself and my reading so well, it is unsurprising to me that the next book on my ranking list would be the book that I bought soon after it was released. I didn't pre-order this one. I certainly didn't read it right away after I bought it, but I did buy a physical copy of it when it was newly released, even if I only got around to reading it once it was nominated for a Hugo. And this is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. This is meant to be the first book in a series, and it is a full novelization of the concept behind Jemisin's short story, The City Born Great, which I believe you can read free online. I loved that story back when I read it. Both the short story and the novel take place in New York City, and this is a book of like extremely local New York City interest. So there is a lot of this that spoke very directly to me as someone who lives in New York. However, there are other aspects of this book that make it something that I would have been less likely to pick up. It's urban fantasy with some Lovecraft vibes. And even when you're subverting Lovecraft like this book does, that's a very hard sell for me. I've not read any Lovecraft, nor do I want to. Even the books that I've read that do the subversion of Lovecraft thing well, like I think this book does, those aspects of the story tend to be the parts that I like the least. I think it is a testament to the strength of Jemisin as a writer that she could make me be as invested in an urban fantasy novel with Lovecraft vibes as I was in this book. She's one of those authors that I do trust to do something that I wouldn't otherwise pick up from another author well enough that I will like it. The Broken Earth trilogy was like that too. I usually would steer pretty clear of a very dark post-apocalyptic fantasy like that. But I appreciated that series immensely. So a modified version of the original short story, The City Born Great, serves as the prologue for this book. In the prologue, the city of New York is coming into consciousness. It is being born, and the person who has become like the magical avatar of the city, because each city that has achieved this state of existence in the world in this universe has like a person who is the avatar of that city, and that person for New York is a young homeless black guy who manages to successfully like help the city be born in defiance of a creepy magical adversary. But at the end something goes wrong, he falls unconscious, and each of the 5 boroughs of New York City manifests its own avatar. So we're introduced to each of the 5 point of view characters who is the avatar of a borough of New York City as this encroaching Lovecraftian other dimensional threat attempts to prevent the city from living. Before I read this book, I had seen other people say that it feels very much like the start of a series, like an introduction to the characters and the premise, and that it doesn't go much further than that. And for a while, I very much agreed with that. And now that I've finished the book, I have slightly more nuanced feelings on that. What this is a portrait of New York City through the lens of fantasy. And if you're expecting the book to do a ton more than that, plot-wise, it's not going to do that. It takes about half of the book to fully introduce us to all 5 POV characters, and that feels incredibly slow pacing-wise. It happens that way in part because the chapters for each character's point of view that we get are so long. They are long, chunky chapters. And honestly, I have no idea why the editorial, authorial decision was made to structure the book this way, because I think it would have felt much less like it was taking a really long time to introduce the basics if those chapters had been divided up and like there were quicker cuts between the 5 characters, because what's happening to all of them is pretty much happening concurrently, and it's not like the main plot, what there is of it, in terms of being attacked by the adversary and ultimately being able to overcome and defeat the adversary. It's not like that isn't happening from the very start. That plot that is like the main plot of the book, that is rolling from the very beginning. And I think it is this very structural thing where it takes so long to introduce the 5 main characters that you don't quite clock how much the main plot is really underway. There is a whole plot arc in addition to it just being a portrait of the city. And it ends at a point where, honestly, you know, if the rest of this series never happens, I'm fine with that ending. It's an open ending, but I can handle open endings. I like open endings. And I do think this would have felt much more like it could have stood as a standalone if it just had had that technical tweak of introducing all the characters faster. That said, the other thing that I feel like I need to talk about with regards to this book is how much, as a portrait of the city, this is already out of date because the pandemic has changed New York City so drastically in the short amount of time since this was published. So reading this for me was a very surreal experience because I felt like I recognized the city as it was being portrayed in this book, but in a sort of nostalgic way, like, oh yeah, back in the days when the office workers used to flock to the offices en masse. Back in the days before outdoor sidewalk dining, before all of these stores had closed, before vast numbers of these people left the city never to return. I remember what it was like back then. So I know, I think I remember that Jemisin has mentioned, like, on Twitter that the way the pandemic is changing the city has changed her idea of how this series needs to progress going forward, and I'm guessing that that's part of why the second book in this series hasn't manifested yet. We don't have news of it yet, or a publication date, or a title, or anything. I can't quite envision where this series could be going from here at this point. And not just because of the city changing in the pandemic. If she were to choose to write the, you know, version of this series in which the pandemic never happened and we're going along with how New York used to be, like, I'm still not quite sure where this series thinks it's going, which is part of why I feel like I'm okay with the resolution, because there isn't a clear, here's what book 2 is going to be, sort of like mapped out for you at the end. So I gave this 4 stars. I really did like it as it was. I will read the sequels when and if they eventually materialize. I don't feel the desperate need for them that I think some other people who've read this book and gotten to the end of it have felt. There's honestly another book on this list that felt more like the beginning of a series that doesn't necessarily stand on its own than this one did to me, and we will get there. So the last 2 books I'm going to talk about were the 2 that I read on ebook from the Hugo voter pamphlet. They are Harrow the Ninth by Tamzin Muir and Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. These 2 both surprised me in that I gave them both 3 stars, but I ranked them very much opposite of how I would have thought I'd end up ranking them before I read either. I ranked Harrow the Ninth above Black Sun, and Black Sun is a book that I was very excited to read. It's one that I thought might end up being a 5-star read for me before I read it. Harrow is a book that I honestly wouldn't have even read if it hadn't been nominated this year. My feelings about the Locked Tomb series is that I will continue to read them as long as they are nominated, but they are enough not my thing that I won't go out of my way to pick them up unless they are Hugo Award nominees. That said, Harrow the Ninth, let's talk about it. Of the books on this list, this one and Piranesi are the 2 that are the most structurally, narratively daring. And that tends to be something that I am strongly inclined to reward when it comes to ranking award nominees. I like narrative storytelling shenanigans, and whoo boy does this book do narrative storytelling shenanigans. That said, this whole series, all of the vibes, they are all wrong for me. I think you really do need to be like at least a certain amount goth to like these books at all, and like, I am 0% goth. In more granular detail though, I think the things that put me off about the vibes of this book are different than the things that put me off about the vibes of Gideon the Ninth, because they are very different books. Both of them I found to be engaging reads that I actually tore through pretty quickly because of the, need to know what's next element of the storytelling. The dramatic difference between these two books is due to a switch in point of view. We are now in Harrow's point of view, and hers is a very different perspective than Gideon's was in book one, in part because, I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, she is going through some like WandaVision level denial of reality in this book. She has altered her memories of everything that happened in book one, and we as the reader know that what happened in book one, and we can tell that like her version of events is not that. And she's got like letters from herself giving herself instructions that like she doesn't remember writing. So we have Harrow's main narrative, and we've also got these basically alternate timeline flashback chapters. That's what they seem like, that are giving us this alternate history of book one, how it did not happen. And it's the sort of storytelling where the more you're paying attention, the more you're looking to pick up clues as to what's going on, the more you will feel rewarded by the experience because your vigilance is rewarded. And I really enjoyed that side of the reading experience of this book. I also had an ongoing Twitter DM chat with someone who remembered the details of book one in greater detail, so I could ask as I was reading for some refreshers of what I should be remembering from book one, and that was very helpful. I'm very grateful. So yeah, there was a level on which this book really, really worked for me. That said, there are some very disturbing vibes. The atmosphere of this entire series is profoundly not my thing. This is a space empire with necromancy. I am still trying to figure out if this is supposed to be our solar system, but in a far magical future. Certainly the 9 planets in the solar system thing seems to hint that it might be. I still maintain, as I did after reading book one, that the whole undead, undying god emperor whose necromancy keeps the solar system resurrected or something, whatever's going on here, this does not seem like a reasonable form of government. I think the series is probably aware of that, but we really haven't gotten to see the like actual civilization and society on the planets in this empire. The first book was sort of a locked room murder mystery where people kept dying in this old decrepit mansion. And this book mostly takes place on a space station, like far away from the planets themselves, where Harrow is training as a lictor, and the lictors and God are preparing for a catastrophic confrontation. So I do still feel very lost with some of the world building. I expect you're supposed to still feel somewhat lost by the end of book two. The thing that was worse for me about this book than about book one is the level of gore, like violent, bloody gore. In this book, there was a lot of like bone magic in book one because that's the type of necromancy that Harrow is trained in. But it didn't squick me nearly as much as I was afraid that it would, because it is mostly the way Harrow was doing it in book one, just like growing constructs from slivers of bone that are like made of bone, but not like actual skeletons of dead humans. There is much more just violent, graphic content in this book. that I did not enjoy reading at all. There is also sort of a contrast for me between the more exciting narrative aspects of this story and some of the more, like, basic tropes that show up in it. With regards to the narrative style, Harrow's voice as a point of view character is very different from Gideon's, but Tamzin Muir's voice as a writer, there's certainly some strong consistency between the two books. She does go for, like, some bonkers, weird, anachronistic humor using a bunch of pop culture references, and I know I missed all of them in book one. I did not catch any of them. But I know there are a bunch in book two that I probably also didn't catch. However, I did catch, like, maybe 3 of them, and that, I'm proud of myself. I even laughed at 2 jokes. I laughed at the random coffee shop AU, and I laughed at Jail for Mother. I think for people who have read book 1, you may be wondering, is Gideon in this? Without delving too far into spoilers, I will say yes, Gideon is in this book, but I am not going to elaborate any further. So this is the rare instance of a 3-star book for me where I feel like this exact setup and plot and narrative structure could have been a 5-star read for me in a book and series with totally different atmosphere and vibes. So that makes it very hard for me to review, very hard for me to judge. This is where I ranked it. This is the rating I gave it. And then Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse is the one that disappointed me the most, because I was really hoping to head over heels love it. And I don't think it doesn't deserve to be here. I don't think it's without merit. I think it has a lot of merit as a starter to an epic fantasy series set in an exciting new fantasy world that's based on pre-Columbian indigenous American civilizations, both North and South American inspirations for, I think, some of the different, like, regions and cultures in this fantasy continent that she's created here. I think compared with Trail of Lightning, which was Roanhorse's debut novel, which was on the Hugo shortlist a couple of years ago, this feels more ambitious. I remember when I was doing my video for the year that Trail of Lightning was on the shortlist, I felt like it sort of stood out as the book that wasn't up to the caliber of the rest of that year's shortlist in terms of originality. There were a lot of books on that year's shortlist that felt like they were doing very exciting new things with the genre, and Trail of Lightning didn't feel like it measured up to me. This book I gave the same rating that I ultimately gave Trail of Lightning, which was 3 stars, but it feels more like a serious awards contender to me in a way that I cannot quite put my finger on. I think this type of page-turning, fairly accessible to read epic fantasy is more my thing than the sort of page-turning, also fairly easy to read, post-apocalyptic urban fantasy that Trail of Lightning was. There are 2 things for me that stood out as, I think, major downsides to Black Sun. One is that I really don't think the plot stands on its own. It is a very introductory book to a series. And second is that I didn't find the character work to be particularly compelling. And I think this might have been true of Trail of Lightning for me as well, even if I didn't realize it at the time. This book has 4 point of view characters, I think, and 2 of them are much more clearly like the driving centers of the plot, and the other 2 are sort of more peripheral observers, at least in this volume. The 2 characters who I think are really the center of the conflict of this book, even though they never meet in this book, are Naranpa and Serapia. Naranpa is the sun priest, like the head priest of the religion in the city of Tova, which is the central city of this religion that is the dominant religious force on this continent. She had a very unlikely rise to this position from basically poverty. She did not come from one of the noble households or the areas of the city that those noble clans govern. She is young and idealistic, and her character feels much more like a sort of cookie-cutter fantasy character archetype than a real living, breathing person. Part of this, I think, is that we sort of get told quite a bit about this religion, which does not worship gods. They revere star charts and prophecies and such, and treat that more as a science. And I never really got a sense for how this functionally works in society in everyday lives. This religion supplanted old gods on this continent, and Serapio, the sort of counterpoint to Naranpa, is a character who was raised far away from Tova to basically challenge the priesthood by he's been sort of magically turned into the avatar of this dead crow god who is prophesied to return. Naranpa is a particularly frustrating character because there are lots of reasons for various factions of people in this world to dislike the priesthood that she represents, but you're supposed to sort of feel like, oh, but if they only knew that she was really a nice person, everyone could get along, and it's grating and frustrating for me. Serapio felt like a more compellingly written character to me as someone who has been, you know, chosen, born, and forced against his will to basically sacrifice his own life in service of someone else's revenge, and has accepted that, but also has feelings about it. My favorite point of view character, though, is one of the ones who's much more secondary to the main plot, who is Shiala, and she is the captain of the ship that's been hired to take Serapio to Tova. She's from, like, an ethnic group of people that have some, like, magical connection to the sea. They are matriarchal, and like there are all sorts of prejudices and superstitions about her people that she has to navigate. And her relationship with Serapio was, on a character level, the most interesting part of the book for me, but on a plot level, it wasn't particularly relevant to anything. And I felt like in this book the things that were more relevant to the main plot weren't given the amount of care that they needed. I don't know. Very weird mixed feelings here. And then the fourth point of view character is a guy whose name I'm forgetting, who comes from the Crow clan that has like a contentious history with the priesthood in the city of Tova, that has like a bunch of cultists who are like waiting for their crow god to return. And point of view character number 4, whose name I still forget, does not have many chapters in this book, but he's in a sort of bind between trying to keep the peace and the growing descent of the sort of cultist base of people within his part of the city. As a series starter, this is a book that ends just when things start to happen. The book is structured as a countdown to the concurrence, the eclipse happening on the winter solstice where Serapio is meant to confront the priesthood. We know from an early chapter that takes place after this has happened that things go very badly for Naranpa, but we don't quite know how we get there. And the whole book is just how do we get there. And it ends at the point where like the status quo has been totally overturned and who knows what happens next. I don't feel like this book stands on its own as strongly as all of the other books in the novel category that I have read. I think that this could be a strong contender in the series category. Once there are 3 books out, I think it is going to be a trilogy. I would be happy to reconsider it at that time for a Hugo, but for this year's slate of nominees, I ranked this last, having not ranked The Relentless Moon because I did not read it. And there you have it. Those are my thoughts on this year's slate of nominees for the Best Novel Hugo category. Let me know if you have read these books, if you agree with me, if you disagree with me. By the time this is posted, we will have a winner we can discuss in the comments. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.